Okay, so let's unpack this. Think about how many decisions, you make in groups every single day. Could be something simple, right? Like choosing where to eat with friends.
Yeah,
Or maybe something much bigger, a team decision at work. Or, I don't know, contributing to a community policy choice.
definitely.
Now, ask yourself this. How much do other people's feelings about the outcome influence your preference? Do you ever find yourself leaning towards a choice that's maybe like slightly less perfect for you personally,
Uh-huh.
just because you know it'll make someone else happier?
Yeah, that feeling, that sort of subtle pull of caring about someone else's satisfaction.
Well, that's precisely what we're diving into today.
Right.
This deep dive is really all about exploring how our social connections and this pretty fascinating mathematical notion of empathy can profoundly shape the outcomes of group decisions.
So we're pulling back the curtain on this using insights from a research paper on empathetic decision-making in social networks.
And our mission, really, is to understand this empathetic framework, figure out why accounting for it is so crucial, and just how much it can shift the outcome of group choices.
And as we'll definitely get into, ignoring this subtle dynamic, well, can actually lead to some pretty bad outcomes for the group overall.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Where do we start? What's empathy mean here?
Right. So at the heart of this research is a very specific definition of empathy in, this group decision-making context.
Okay.
It's not just about, intellectually understanding someone else's viewpoint. It's about actually deriving personal satisfaction, or what they call utility, from their happiness or their utility with whatever outcome is chosen. They call these other regarding preferences.
Okay. So every person has their own sort of intrinsic preference, what they like best if they were deciding totally alone.
Exactly. That's your baseline.
But then this empathetic preference adds another layer. You gain utility just from how much others in the group feel good about that same option.
Precisely. So a person's total utility for any given decision is this combination. It's their own intrinsic preference plus this empathetic preference component.
In the social network, that's going to be key here, right? How people are connected.
Absolutely key.
Yeah.
The research models this influence using what's called a weighted directed graph.
Okay, like a map.
Kind of. Think of it like a map where the nodes are people and the connections, the edges between them, show who influences whom empathetically.
And the weights.
The weight on a connection tells you the strength of that empathetic link. How much do you actually care about that specific person's utility?
Gotcha. Let's maybe use an example. The paper had one with a family choosing a restaurant.
Yeah, that's a great illustration. Figure 1A in the paper.
Yeah.
You've got a family of 4 trying to pick a restaurant.
Okay.
Each person, has their own ranking of what they intrinsically prefer.
Yeah.
Maybe dad wants Italian, mom wants Thai, one kid wants burgers.
Standard family dilemma.
Right. But, and this is crucial, their final utility, their overall happiness with the chosen restaurant isn't just about their personal taste. It's also influenced by how much they care about the others enjoying it. So, maybe mom cares a lot about dad's happiness with the choice, maybe weight 0.7, like in their example.
Wow, okay. High weight.
Yeah. But perhaps she cares a bit less about, say, the teenage son's preference, or vice versa. The network edges and those weights capture these specific relationships and how strong they are.
Okay, that makes sense. The network shows who cares about whom and how much.
Exactly. And this leads us to two main variations in how you can mathematically model this empathetic preference. Two main ways to think about it.
Okay, what are they?
So the first one is called the local empathetic model.
Local, okay.
Yeah. In this version, a person's empathetic utility, that boost they get from others' happiness, comes directly from the intrinsic utility of their neighbors in the network.
Intrinsic utility.
Yeah.
So just what the neighbor originally wanted before considering anyone else.
Precisely. Let's think about that family movie night again.
Okay.
A parent's utility for picking, say, an animated movie might go up simply because they know their child intrinsically loves animated movies.
Right, the kid just likes cartoons. Full stop.
Exactly. It doesn't matter yet how the child's total happiness might be influenced by others. The parent just cares about the child's initial personal happiness with that specific choice.
Got it. So mathematically, it's like a weighted sum of those basic intrinsic preferences from the people you're directly connected to.
You got it. And the overall importance of each person's intrinsic preference in the final group outcome. Well, under the local model, it's simply the sum of how much others directly care about them. Just add up the incoming edge weights.
Okay, that seems relatively straightforward. Local means you care about your neighbor's initial happiness.
Right.
But you said there were two models. What's the second one? This is where it gets really interesting, you mentioned.
Yes, this is where the ripple effect really comes into play. This is the global empathetic model.
Global. Okay. Sounds bigger.
It is. In the global model, a person's empathetic utility comes from the total utility of their neighbors.
Not just intrinsic. Total.
Exactly. And that total utility itself depends on their neighbors' total utilities, and so on. The influence, the caring, it spreads through the entire network. It's not just direct connections anymore.
Oh, wow. Okay, like maybe companies in a supply chain.
Yeah.
Or different departments in a big organization.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
One company might care about its supplier's overall success, their total utility, right?
Right. Which depends on how well the supplier is doing with their partners.
Exactly. Further down the chain or across the network, it's not just about the supplier's immediate, isolated gain from one transaction. It's about their holistic well-being within the network, which affects everyone connected in this sort of chain reaction.
Okay, that sounds way more complex to calculate.
It is. It creates this interdependent system of utilities.
Yeah.
The paper actually shows it's mathematically quite similar to how influence measures like PageRank work in network analysis.
Oh, interesting. Like how Google used to rank web pages.
Sort of, yeah. Where value or importance spreads iteratively through the connections. Now, for this whole system to actually work, mathematically speaking, to be well-defined and have a unique, stable solution, the authors identify some key conditions. And they argue these conditions make sense for many real-world group decisions, especially in functional groups,
Yeah.
where people can't just easily opt out.
What are they, roughly?
Well, things like weights have to be non-negative. So no envy or spite is modeled here.
Okay, fair enough for cooperative settings.
Right. Everyone has to care about their own intrinsic utility at least a little bit. You have zero self-interest.
Makes sense.
And the outgoing weights, how much empathy you distribute to others, have to sum to one. These conditions basically guarantee that the utilities settle down and don't, explode or become unstable.
Okay. And finding the best group decision under this global model. How does that work? Is it still about intrinsic preferences somehow?
Yes. Ultimately, it still boils down to maximizing a weighted sum of intrinsic preferences.
Oh, okay. So similar to local in that sense.
Similar in form, yes. But the weights for each person under the global model are much more complex to figure out. They reflect not just who you're directly connected to, but all the cumulative empathetic influence flowing through the entire network structure. The paper shows examples where these global weights look quite different from the simpler local ones.
Right. So what's the big takeaway from having these two different models?
Well, it really means the way you choose to model empathy, or if you ignore it completely, which is the classical approach, it results in different overall utilities being assigned to each potential option. And crucially, this can lead to choosing a completely different optimal decision for the group.
So an outcome that looks best if you only look at what individuals want for themselves might actually be far from optimal when you factor in how much they care about each other's happiness.
Exactly. Table 1 in the paper shows this clearly for that restaurant example. Depending on whether you use the intrinsic-only, local, or global model, the best restaurant choice actually changes. It could be A, B, or C.
Okay, so why should you, the listener, care about these different models and weights? How does this actually apply outside of, academic papers?
Well, I think these ideas are highly relevant to all sorts of real-world group decisions you probably encounter quite often.
Like what?
Think about group recommendation systems. Suggesting movies for friends or books for a reading group.
Okay, yeah.
Or team decisions at work, choosing which software to adopt or what project strategy to pursue or how to allocate resources within the team. It applies to local community projects, maybe policy choices, even more formal resource allocation problems, like distributing items or tasks among people fairly.
So basically, anytime a group makes a collective choice, and the members actually care even a little about each other's satisfaction, this dynamic could be at play.
Precisely. And understanding it might help make better group choices.
How is this different, though, from just opinion spreading? Like, if my friends all like a movie, maybe I start liking it too. Or standard economic stuff like externalities.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction to make. While it's related, this model is specifically focused on how caring about other satisfaction, their utility with the final outcome, drives your preferences. It's not just about your opinion converging with your friends, which is more like social influence on belief.
Right.
And it's not like a standard externality where, say, the noise from your neighbor's factory directly impacts your well-being, regardless of their happiness.
Okay.
Here, it's about your personal utility for choosing option A, changing. Because, choosing A makes others happy or satisfied.
Yeah.
It's about deriving utility from their utility.
Yeah.
It's a different mechanism driving preference formation.
Got it. It's about caring about their feelings about the outcome.
Exactly.
Okay, so modeling this empathy is important because it changes what the actual optimal outcome is for the group. But finding that outcome, especially with that complex global model in like potentially huge networks, that sounds computationally really hard.
It definitely can be. I mean, the goal is to find the decision that maximizes the total group welfare, right? The sum of everyone's empathetic utilities.
Yeah.
And like we said, this is equivalent to maximizing a weighted sum of the intrinsic utilities.
Yeah.
But figuring out those complex cumulative weights in the global model, especially if you have thousands or millions of connections, that's the real hurdle.
So we need some efficient algorithms to actually do this in practice. What does the paper suggest?
Yeah, exactly. The authors propose two scalable iterative algorithms designed specifically to tackle this, particularly for large networks.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first one is called ICE. That stands for Iterated Candidate Elimination.
ICE. Okay, what's the idea?
So ICE focuses on finding the best alternative directly, without needing to calculate those exact, complex, global empathetic weights first.
Oh, interesting. How does it manage that?
Well, think of it like this. It iteratively updates an estimated utility, or an estimated level of group satisfaction for each potential option. And it does this based on how much satisfaction neighbors seem to get from it in the previous round of estimation.
Okay, so it's like maybe a committee discussing options over several meetings.
Yeah.
Instead of doing some complex math to figure out everyone's formal influence score, each member just kind of adjusts how much they like an option in this meeting based on how happy others seem to be with it during the last discussion.
That's a great analogy. Yes. It's like people adjusting your view based on their friends' perceived happiness from the last round.
And the elimination part.
Ah, yeah, that's a clever part of ICE.
Yeah.
It prunes away unlikely winners as it goes.
Oh.
If, after several rounds of updating these estimates, an option's estimated total group welfare falls too far below the current best-looking option, the algorithm just eliminates it from consideration. It says, okay, this one's probably not going to be the winner. Let's stop wasting computation on it. The examples in the paper, like Figure 2 and Table 2, show how this iterative process can quickly narrow down the choices. Like candidate A gets knocked out because B just keeps looking better and the gap gets too big.
Got it. So ICE is efficient, finds the optimal decision, even in large networks, and the paper suggests it converges pretty quickly in practice.
That's right. It focuses on just finding the winner efficiently.
Okay, what's the second algorithm then?
The second algorithm is WICE, or weight-based iterated candidate elimination.
WICE. Okay, weight-based.
Yeah.
So this one, I'm guessing, does calculate those global empathetic weights.
Exactly. WICE focuses on iteratively calculating those estimated societal weights first.
Societal weights, meaning?
It's basically figuring out whose intrinsic preference ends up having the most cumulative influence or societal weight on the overall group welfare once all the empathy ripples through the network.
Ah, okay. Like trying to figure out whose initial vote or preference ultimately carries the most weight in the final collective outcome when you account for everyone caring about everyone else.
Yes, that's a really good way to think about it. It's like calculating those influence scores spreading through the network.
And then it uses those weights.
Yeah, WICE then uses these updated weight estimates to calculate the estimated social welfare for each option and prune candidates, similar to how ICE does it.
So WICE gives you the weights themselves, which could be valuable information on its own, right? To understand the group dynamic.
Absolutely. It helps you see why a particular option might be chosen by showing the underlying influence structure.
And it finds the winner. How does it compare to ICE in terms of speed?
Well, the paper suggests WICE can sometimes be faster than ICE, particularly when there are a very large number of alternatives to choose from, even though it sometimes needs more iterations to calculate the weights accurately.
Interesting trade-off.
Yeah. Both algorithms, though, are shown to be efficient and converge pretty quickly in practice. So they seem like viable tools for larger real-world scenarios.
And does the network structure affect how fast they converge?
It does, interestingly. The paper finds that the speed of convergence is related to network properties, specifically networks with less overall empathy meaning people have a higher degree of self-interest, a higher self-loop weight, actually converge faster for these algorithms.
Huh. Less empathy makes the math easier, maybe.
Something like that, yeah. The interdependencies are perhaps less complex to resolve iteratively.
Fascinating. Okay, so the models exist, the algorithms exist to find the optimal choice under these models. What happens when the researchers actually put them to the test? What did the empirical results show about why ignoring empathy really matters?
Right, this is where it gets really compelling. They ran a bunch of experiments using both random networks with simulated preferences, and also using real preferences from, I think it was Irish voting data.
Yeah.
And they compared the decisions made and the resulting group welfare when using different models.
Yeah.
So, for instance, what happens if you assume only intrinsic preferences exist versus using the true global empathetic model?
And they measured things like, did the models pick the same winner? And how much worse was the outcome if you used the wrong model?
Exactly. They used metrics like disagreement, basically. Did the chosen winner differ between models?
Mm-hmm.
And relative or normalized social welfare loss, essentially, how much worse, in percentage terms, was the outcome chosen by the simpler model compared to the truly optimal outcome under the more complex true model.
And what did they find? Was ignoring empathy a big deal?
It was a very big deal. The results were really quite clear and, frankly, kind of eye-opening.
Oh, yeah.
The absolute key finding is that ignoring empathy leads to significantly suboptimal outcomes, just flat out. Across various settings, different types of networks, different preferences,
Yeah.
they found substantial decision disagreement.
Meaning you pick the wrong thing for the group often.
Often, yes. In some simulations, over 50% of the time. Even with real data, it was frequently in the 20–40% range. If you only looked at individual preferences, you'd often pick a completely different winner than if you correctly accounted for people caring about each other.
Wow. Okay, so you're picking the wrong option. Does it matter much? Is the option you pick much worse?
Yes, that's the other part. It wasn't just picking a slightly different, maybe second best option. There was often significant social welfare loss associated with picking that wrong winner.
Oh, significant.
Well, the paper reports average losses in group welfare, group happiness, around 20–30% in some of the synthetic scenarios when ignoring empathy.
20 to 30% loss. That's huge.
It is. Now, with the real voting data, the average loss was smaller, maybe 1–3%, but the maximum losses observed could still be quite high, sometimes up to 40%.
So even if it's not always catastrophic, ignoring these social connections really costs the group quantifiable happiness or utility sometimes.
Precisely. This isn't just some, theoretical difference between models. It means relying on classical preference aggregation methods that ignore social ties often picks a demonstrably suboptimal winner, causing a measurable loss in the group's collective well-being.
Wow. Okay, that's a powerful finding. What else stood out from the experiments?
Another really important practical finding was that the simpler local empathetic model actually turned out to be a pretty decent approximation for the more complex global one.
Oh, really? So you don't always need the super complex model.
It seems that way. The differences in the decisions made and the resulting welfare loss when comparing the local versus the global model were generally very small in their experiments.
That's good news for practical application, I guess.
Definitely. It suggests the simpler, local model, which is easier to think about and maybe compute, often captures much of the important dynamic of empathy.
Did anything make the penalty for ignoring empathy worse?
Yes. They found that more complexity or scale generally increased the penalty.
How so?
For example, as the number of alternatives, M increased so, more choices available. The social welfare loss and the decision disagreement both jumped significantly if you compared the empathetic models to the intrinsic only one. Basically, more options mean more ways to be wrong if you ignore the social ties.
Makes sense. More chances to pick something that makes influential people unhappy.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Also, the type of scoring rule used mattered. Sharper rules like plurality voting led to higher losses when ignoring empathy compared to smoother rules like board account.
Interesting. And the network structure itself, did that play a role?
Big time. They looked at the effect of alpha, which is basically the self-loop weight, or how much you care about your own intrinsic preference versus others.
Okay.
They found that when there was more empathy in the network, meaning alpha was lower, people cared relatively more about others' happiness. Then ignoring that empathy resulted in much higher welfare losses and decision disagreement.
So the more interdependent people actually are, the more critical it becomes to model that interdependence correctly.
Exactly. You pay a bigger price for ignoring it when it's stronger.
What about the shape of the network, like random versus structured?
Yeah, they looked at that too. They found higher losses when comparing global versus intrinsic in more hierarchical network.
Hierarchical, like an organization chart.
Sort of, yeah. Networks with more directed influence flow. This really highlights the potential importance of modeling empathy correctly in structured settings like organizations or maybe supply chains, where influence isn't just random.
Okay. And did these ideas apply beyond just voting or choosing one item? You mentioned resource allocation earlier.
Yes, they extended the analysis to look at empathetic resource allocation.
Like dividing up goods or tasks.
Exactly. And they found, maybe unsurprisingly at this point, that ignoring empathy causes welfare loss there too. Not just when picking a single winner, but also in problems like allocating multiple items to people.
And when was that loss biggest?
It was particularly noticeable under conditions of higher homogeneity, meaning people tend to like similar things, and also under increased scarcity of the resources being allocated.
Ah, so when things are tight and people kind of want the same stuff, ignoring empathy hurts more.
Seems so.
Yeah.
And it suggests that maybe in allocation problems within a group that has these empathetic ties, you might want to consider prioritizing items not just based on who wants it most intrinsically, but potentially based on their overall societal weight, that complex global weight we talked about, which reflects their influence and how much others care about their satisfaction.
So you might give something to someone who doesn't want it quite as much intrinsically, but whose happiness with it has a bigger positive ripple effect on the whole group's welfare.
Potentially, yes. That's the kind of counterintuitive outcome that accounting for empathy might suggest.
Wow. Okay. So let's try and sum this all up then. This deep dive into empathetic decision-making. It really shows that our social ties, how much we care about others' satisfaction. It's not just some fuzzy, nice-to-have concept.
Not at all. It has a profound, measurable, quantifiable impact on what the truly optimal decision is for a group.
And just ignoring this empathy, relying on simpler models that only look at isolated individual preferences, that can lead to picking the wrong thing, and significant loss in the group's overall well-being.
Absolutely. The models and the algorithms presented in this research give us some powerful tools to actually understand and potentially account for these empathetic preferences and all sorts of group decisions, from, movie nights to complex resource allocation.
It definitely feels like this is just scratching the surface, though. The authors themselves point to important next steps, right?
Oh, for sure. Big questions remain, like how do you actually measure empathy and map out these network structures accurately in real-world settings? That's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I was wondering that. It's not like people walk around with weights floating over their heads.
Exactly. Plus, testing these ideas on even larger, more complex data sets, exploring other kinds of group decision problems, like maybe multi-winner elections, developing models that maybe use qualitative rankings instead of precise utility numbers.
And what about how preferences change? People don't just have fixed preferences, right? They influence each other.
Right. Studying how preferences actually form and evolve over time on these networks through iterative updates and social influence, that's another massive area for future work mentioned.
It really makes you think, though. This research kind of pushes us to see that the collective good, it might not just be the simple sum of what individuals want for themselves.
It's deeply intertwined with how we feel about each other's happiness, all structured by the network of connections between us.
It's about understanding that our social connections shape not just maybe our opinions, but our fundamental preferences when we make choices together.
Well said.
So here's a final thought for you listening. Consider the group decisions you're part of today, big or small. How much are your preferences and the preferences of those around you being shaped by this subtle, maybe unconscious form of empathy? And is the final outcome you reach, is it truly the best one for the group as a whole if those underlying dynamics aren't really being considered?
Yeah, a lot to think about there. And thanks again for sharing the source material that made this deep dive possible today.
Absolutely. And to everyone listening, if you have source material, research papers, articles, anything you'd like us to deep dive into, please do send it our way. We'd love to see it.